Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Uncensored CMO. Now, in this episode, I am talking to one of the titans of our industry, someone who I think has had a bigger impact on our industry than perhaps anybody else. He is Sir Martin Sorrell, founder and owner of WPP, the biggest holding company in the world. He has since gone on to set up S4 Capital, so now finds himself in the challenger position rather than the dominant player. I wanted to talk to Sir Martin about what he sees as the biggest challenges facing our industry today. What are the disruptions coming down the line that are going to affect and shape our industry in the future? What's his advice to CMOs? What do CMOs need to care about and what should they be doing? What skills do they need to deal with the challenges coming at them in the world today? And because it's Cannes, I wanted to ask him about AI, of course. And in fact, just to do that, I asked ChatGPT to give me some questions about AI to Sir Martin. Also want to find out a little bit more about him as a person, his background and what motivates him, and why is he still going, having had the success he has. Here's my conversation with Sir Martin Sorrell. Listen, I thought, if it's okay, obviously, you're reasonably well known, I think it's fair to say.
A little bit.
But I'd love to start at the beginning.
In my own mind.
Okay. In your own mind, yes. Indeed. Take us back to when you were growing up. What did you want to be?
I wanted to open the batting for England.
Okay, fair enough.
Nobody understands what that means. I was very... Leonard Hutton was my sort of idol, I think. He was a Yorkshire England captain. Sir Leonard Hutton, actually. So I'd probably want to open the batting for England is probably the answer to that.
Brilliant.
I got into advertising by accident, really, because my dad said... what you should do is you should find an industry you enjoy, find a company within it that you enjoy and have fun with, and then build a reputation. Not a reputation, to do podcasts with you and can, but just to in the area in which you operated. And then if you fancied doing something on your own, and the magical age was 40 actually, because 40 was the age when you'd done your first 20 years.
Yeah.
And you had your other, because people used to retire at 60, they didn't carry on like I've done. But so you could, build a reputation. If you fancy doing something on your own when you're around 40, go ahead and do it. So that was it. And I sort of fell into it because I was working for James Gulliver, who was a very successful food retailing entrepreneur. He sold fine fare to RCA Corporation. Don't ask me how a retail food operations ends up inside RCA Corporation, but it did. And James had a fair bit of money, and he hired me as his personal financial counselor, which actually wasn't an accurate description. I was really his gopher. I used to carry his bag. And we invested in a number of things. We invested in Taverner Rutledge, which was a sweet manufacturer up in Manchester, Sayers Confectioners, which was a bakery also up in the north, in Alpine Double Glazing.
Oh, really?
These were all sort of small public companies which had done pretty well or were stagnating and anything. And then the other thing was Garland Compton. And Garland Compton was run by a man called Ken Gill, and it had gone public. So it was Garland, the Garland agency in London, plus Compton in America had a stake in it. And Ken Gill was worried about the creative reputation of Garland Compton. It had Procter as its biggest client, J&J, I think, Eli Lilly and some others. And he said to James, a good friend of James Gulliver, said, I'm thinking about goosing up the creative reputation, and I've got, there's these Saatchi brothers. And what Morris and Charles did was effectively they did a reverse takeover of Garland Compton, which had gone public. Mm. And James was consulting for them, and I ended up being the sort of consultant. So I used to go into Charlotte Street one day a week. I had an office in Charlotte Street, not on the top floor where Morris and Charles were, but I think it was on the second or third floor. And I used to do consulting for them for about, half a day a week. And then Morris wanted to hire a CFO. And the consultants were with a firm called Goddard, Kay and Rogers. And the consultant was called Brian Burwash. It was all very funny stuff, actually. And Morris said to Brian one day, because they had difficulty finding a CFO for Garland Compton as a listed company. The guy who was running it was, past 11 o'clock in the morning, was somewhat sort of non-compos mentis. And they went looking in Fleet Street for a CFO. Most of the CFOs were non-compos mentis after 11 o'clock, if you get my drift.
Yes.
And Morris said to Brian, Brian said to Morris, what sort of person do you want? Somebody like Martin. So have you asked Martin? No. So Brian asked me, and that was it.
Wow.
So that was how I got it. I sort of fell into it. And Morris I liked, and Charles I liked, and the atmosphere was great. Tim Bell was there, Jeremy Sinclair, Bill Muirhead, I mean, all of whom have survived to this very day. And it was an exciting place to be. Nothing was impossible.
Yeah.
Except if you got public recognition for it. So it's very funny, actually, because Morris would say to me, or say to everybody, Procter & Gamble never have, an individual. It's always Procter & Gamble, both of whom were dead. And, Saatchi would be the same. I said, well, Morris, but the slight difference, you're alive, Charlie's alive, and it's Saatchi. So you could do anything you liked as long as you didn't get any public recognition for it. And Tim, Tim was often people referred to me as a third brother, or Tim as a third brother. Tim was really the third brother, sadly died a few years ago. But Tim fell into that trap with the Conservative Party and Margaret Thatcher. He became too famous as an individual. We'll come back to this because I think it's an important point in our industry. It's what bedevils our industry to some extent. Anyway, so Tim carved out with Gordon Rees. Gordon Rees was Maggie Thatcher's sort of political guru, the one who lowered her voice and looked after, how she looked and what she said. And Tim got very involved as a personal advisor. And that's, but Saatchi's was a great business. Manhattan Landing, the work for Israel, the Pregnant Man ad. I mean, all this was all part of the folklore. Not that you see anything like that at Cannes anymore.
Well, we're going to come on and talk about that. I'd love to get your views on
I don't think the ad that BA did matches Manhattan Landing. Anyway.
Well, let's jump to that.
Won an award here this week. The outdoor
how do you assess the state of creativity now as you look back? Firstly, how many times have you been to Cannes?
I would say, I don't know, it's about 15 or 20 times. I never used to come. We basically set ourselves the objective at WPP to win at Cannes. Yeah. To win. And we had a run of, I think it was about 5 years. I think it started about 2014. And when I left in 18, they flubbed it in 2019, and then they seemed to reassess the importance of it. It's very different to what it was. I mean, it's certainly nowhere near what Roger Hatchuel envisioned. I think it was a bunch of French creatives having a glass of rosé in the south of France in June. And I don't think if you and I were trying to redesign or set up the equivalent of Cannes, that we would do it in June in the south of France. Yeah. I think we would probably pick an off-peak period, like, sort of February or March or something, or maybe January, rather like Davos, and find a place where, the rates were slightly lower and maybe, a bit more isolated so that people couldn't do anything else. I mean, the trouble here is that there's lots of other things to do in it, to virtue. And in fact, it's really interesting you asked me the question, because I saw somebody today who was her first time here, who worked for a UK company, a retailer. And I said, what do you think of it? And she said, well, nobody looks at the work. And that is true. I mean, most people bugger off on Thursday now. They don't stay for the awards on Friday, except the winners. Whereas before, that was very much the reverse. We all stuck around. We wanted to see who won, etc. So I think it's very different. It's to me, Cannes has become like CES, and CES has become like Cannes. And maybe the common coefficient to that is Media Link, because CES was too technological. Yeah. So they wanted to be a bit sexier, so they called on Media Link, and then Cannes with Essential and Media Link is not part of Essential anymore, but it's the same thing. But I think it's I'm going to say it's past its sell-by date. I think it's got to change. I think it's
in what ways do you think?
Well, I think a number of people said to me today and yesterday and the day before that it's too much. And it's become very superficial. So, it's speed dating. which is good because it brings everybody together at the same point in time.
Yep.
So it's a networking event. But no, you lose sight of the event. It's rather like Davos in the sense that it used to be that we used to listen to the content, to the panels and the speeches and the initiatives. I sort of feel that this is more, there's a lot of people here don't have badges. The price of badges has gone up so significantly. Price of a hotel room is ridiculous. I heard last night that the pre-COVID agreements that the hotels had entered into, they're not prepared to stick by them. So you've got pricing and, dare I say, gouging on pricing. And I think, in a funny way, and this is the trouble with all conferences, they're not in real time. So they're planned a year before. So this planning might have been right for a year ago, but it's not right for this point in time.
Yeah.
And some of the things going on here are probably downright embarrassing from an external point of view in terms of cost.
Yeah.
And entertainment, and it almost comes down to my party is bigger than yours, or whose party is the biggest, and so I think it's sort of lost a bit of its focus. Now, having said that, we'll come on to this. Technology there are two drivers of our industry. One is a geographical driver, and the other is a technology driver. And obviously, technology is paramount. And you see the 6 big platforms represented here, the 3 Western, the 3 Eastern. And you see Amazon and Apple and Microsoft with big presences as well. And of course, Salesforce and Adobe and LG and Samsung and Shopify and Spotify and Oracle and scads of others, but and Pinterest and Twitter and Snap and etc. It's very technologically driven, and I think it's lost the focus around creativity. So we can get into that in a little bit more.
Well, let's obviously Uncensored CMO podcast. We're talking to an audience of CMOs. What should CMOs be concerned about now, as with your experience looking around the world?
Well, I think there are 3 things that we bang on about, and I had a meeting with a major global, or 2 major global companies this afternoon before coming here. And it permeates those conversations. I mean, obviously AI is a focus, but we'll come on to that as well, but we're abstracting that from that in a minute. I think agility, people talk about agility. Every CEO says their organization is agile, including agencies, and if you have to deal with them, you find out that they aren't. So agility is key. Taking back control is key as well. After the great financial crisis, the vogue thing was zero-based budgeting, which was nothing new. But, 3G, Jorge Lehmann and his colleagues really sort of got people to focus on it. And that meant, defenestrating everything, starting from a base of 0 and building up. It wasn't a new concept. I mean, it was messaged as being new, but it wasn't. I mean, when I was at business school 55 years ago, we had it. Hal Janine at IT&T used to practice it. It's nothing new, but what it did was it pushed a lot of stuff out of the client. So it was outsourced. So we have 3 models at Media Monks, S4's operating brand. We have the classic outsource model where agencies operate. We have an embedded model where we put people into the client. They might have the client's T-shirt on, but there are people on our payroll. And then you have the in-house model, which we're not frightened to do ourselves out of business. Most of the holding companies are terrified of losing. We think in-housing works in various situations, both media and creative. We were the subject of a Harvard Business School case study on the in-housing of Sprint, and went on to do T-Mobile as well after they took over Sprint. So I think, taking back control is really important. Interesting at the moment, because there's this focus on short-term results and short-term performance, which I think will continue. The idea of in-housing, probably CFOs and chief procurement officers are saying, no, we don't want more headcount, so outsource more.
Yep.
But in time, particularly driven by AI and AGI and blockchain and metaverse, which I think are the 3 technological, NFTs and crypto sort of fading a little bit into, more than a little bit into the background. But those 3 things, blockchain, meta, and AI, AGI are fundamental. And I think that will drive things more in-house. And I think that will become it. So take back control. So agility, take back control. And then the last point is first-party data. So when Google announced the deprecation of third-party cookies, although we still haven't got the final timetable, and when Apple did their change in IDFA, that meant that clients who had been building third-party data platforms had a real problem. I mean, it was first announced by Google. I remember the last thing before COVID in January of 2020 that I went to was a conference in Scandinavia, and Google had just had the second blog on deprecation of third-party cookies. A lot of the clients there, although at that conference, a Google organized conference, although they were great fans of Google, otherwise they wouldn't have been there, they were somewhat irritated by the fact that there was a deprecation of third-party cookies because they were building third-party databases.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
And so first-party data becomes really important. So you see the growth of the retailers' walled gardens as well, which is their answer to the Amazonian surge. So I think those three things. So, agility, taking back control, and first-party data.
Now, almost reluctant to mention the word, because it always seems to be our word, isn't there, or a theme at every can. But we must talk about AI, of course.
Yes.
How real a game changer do you think AI is?
I think it's real.
And where do you think the impact is?
I think real, and there's, when people talk about AI or AGI, there are two sort of emotions that it engenders. One is wonder. I mean, isn't it incredible? And it's going to be doing incredible things. The other is fear. So I did a conversation with Antti Scaramucci in London recently, and a woman came up to me with her daughter afterwards and said, my daughter works at one of the holding companies, I won't say which one, and is she going to lose her job? And she might, could be the answer, but I said, well, not if she learns to use it as a tool. So with that as background, fear and wonder, or wonder and fear, because I mean it is as big as the web, it is as big as smartphones. I mean it's another industrial revolution, and it's fundamental. We see already 5 areas where AI, AGI is developing. The first is on productivity improvements on copywriting and visualization. So ads that took 2 weeks to do take 2 hours. So huge savings, huge improvements in productivity. So much so that we've altered our go-to-market from faster, better, cheaper to faster, better, cheaper, and and more, and now being instantaneous implementation. But more means we can produce more assets and be more effective. So I would say that's the first thing. So visualizing copywriting, and I should say one interesting thing is the Unreal Engine, which is Epic Games' Fortnite technology, which we had utilized extensively. We built a studio in New Delhi, which means that we could shoot any commercial anywhere in the world from New Delhi.
Wow.
If you want to do Rio de Janeiro, we might have to have Brazilian or Portuguese-speaking actors in India. But essentially, what's really interesting about the AI surge is the Unreal Engine also almost did the same thing. You don't have to go to 6 locations and spend 3 months producing the most beautiful film. You can do it where you are. But anyway, so that's number one.
I think the obvious question, in people's minds with that is, what happens to originality and creativity, and how do you avoid basically everyone creating the same?
Well, no, but you can do it. You can do it to such a heightened degree. So for Netflix, which I think is the model, it's a data-driven model where the data determines the creative, and you pump it out through digital media, you look at the results, and then you refine the product. If it doesn't work, you refine it or you alter it. So for Netflix, historically, we might produce 1.6 million, was the Narcos example, 1.6 million, theoretically. Different creative executions, you could now do 5 million, right? So what was interesting about the conversation we had this afternoon was that, there were 12 product managers, global, sitting around, and what it meant was that the production period gets concertinaed down to literally hours, which gives them more time. They produce more assets, which means that they have to be more selective in what they use, and it has to be more iterative. So I think it's all to the good.
Yeah.
I mean, it may be that clients, we've had 1 or 2 clients who already said to us they want productivity savings, or to share the productivity savings with us. But what it does is it's really interesting, it enables people to focus on the content and how effective the content is rather than the production of the content. So you've shut down that period and it's expanded the amount. So it's a bit like, when you say about AI will destroy the mundane jobs and give people more time to do the brain jobs or the whatever, however you describe it. So that's the first area. The second area is hyper-personalization at scale. So we can do on a super scale, hence the more. The third is media planning and buying. And I think that, the best way of putting it is, you wouldn't, what would you prefer to do? Use a 25-year-old media planner or buyer or an algorithm? And certainly in the digital space, which is now 2/3 of client budgets, and the media market's 900 billion, probably digital media is about 600, 650. And it's going to be 75% of client budgets by 2025, according to the forecasters. So I think the holding companies are in for a very rude shock on this. I mean, there is no way that if they employ 350, 400,000 people currently to distribute media planning and buying, is not going to be the case in 2 years. That is the situation.
And is that because of their overhead they're carrying?
There's no need for it. And again, I say, the algorithm will prove it. You'll need agencies to validate. Now, you wouldn't give your media budget to Rupert Murdoch and say, invest it without validation. No insult intended to Rupert Murdoch, but there would be bias there. So you need somebody as a countervailing party or as a reseller to validate what's going on. I also think it means that the platforms are going to get closer to the clients. So the six. I would come on to. I also think that it means that the 6 big platforms are going to become even more significant. They're being checked by the regulator from doing acquisitions. Giphy and Activision with Microsoft. So 6 platforms, 3 West, 3 East, plus Microsoft and Apple, Salesforce, etc. They're going to become NVIDIA. Obviously, have a monopoly position in the picks and shovels for AI. I think they are going to become even more important. So if you thought they were big now, stand by. And the regulator is forcing them. Their research budgets are huge. Their research budget as a percentage of their revenues are huge, and in absolute sense are huge. So they will be investing more in organic development. AI, AGI gives them. So media planning and buying. The fourth area is use of AI as a super tool, i.e., improving our processes, improving clients' processes. And the fifth area, which I think is the most interesting, is knowledge. So, and it comes back to what I said before about egos and industry. Good people are difficult to manage, which is a dangerous thing to say because average people then think to be good, they have to be difficult. So you defeat your purpose. But the real jewels in our industry are those people who are good and good at building their brand, if it's a multi-branded model. Ours is a unitary model, but are good at participating in that. But engage other people who are good individually and make great decisions and make great progress, but they bring in the team. Those people are very rare, right? You walk down the Croisette, I'm still a shareholder in WPP, and what do I see? I see WPP, Group M, and Ogilvy. Makes no sense, right? What's the point? I mean, if you need more space, you're trying to create one firm. Even publicists, talk about the power of one. You walk into their reception and you see 47 brands.
Yeah.
So I think our industry is bedeviled by that problem, that the individual almost becomes more powerful than the entity. And there's a great parallel with the fashion industry. There was a tremendous documentary recently, I think it was on BBC iPlayer, about Arnault and Gucci and Pinot, and about Tom Ford and Alexander McQueen, etc. And the lesson from the film was, it's a great film, everybody should watch it, particularly in our industry, was that the creative directors weren't the most important people. It was the brand. The brand that always won in the end. And that Arnault understands that big time.
Yeah.
He's built the biggest company in Europe, over $500 billion in market value. Was the world's richest man, and I think Elon Musk has edged ahead again, but as built by understanding that the brands are really important. I mean, the people are really important, but the brands is where the strength, and there's a parallel to our industry. So getting people, and going back to the knowledge factor around AI will enable us to enfranchise everybody inside the organization with the power of knowledge. So what's happening now is that people protect their areas because they control the knowledge. At least in theory, AI will enable everybody. We have 8,700 people, and I often say I wish everyone knew what the other 8,699 knew. And the guy who resigned from Google said he was resigning. He said it was an existential threat because the bots. He used 10,000 bots. Every bot would know what every other bot knew instantly.
Yeah.
Right. And in a way, AI will get us to a situation not quite as perfect as that, but where if we give people open access and if the data that is ingested is good data and gets better and better, that will give knowledge to everybody in the organization. So the thing that drives me nuts, which is a question I always like to ask people, what drives you nuts and about the business or the brand you're running or whatever it happens to be, is when somebody in our organization says, I didn't know that we had done that, or so-and-so had been involved in that, or we were in this geography, or we had this capability, or whatever.
So with all this in mind, what's your advice to marketing teams? What kind of skill set do they need to be able to handle this?
Well, if you think about AI, the oil of AI is data. And, going back to the agility, take back control, first-party data mantra, clearly control of data, first-party data for deprecation reasons, IDFA reasons as well, becomes critically important. And, I would advise every client to look at their agreement with their media agency as to who controls the data. Because many media agencies control the data, and that's the way they exert control over the client, and they prevent change. In an AI world, at the very least, everybody should be experimenting now. You should break off a brand, preferably give it to us to work on. You break off a brand and start to experiment with the productivity around copywriting and visualization around hyper-personalization. You've got nothing to lose, and you should do it quickly. You don't have to turn the whole organization upside down by doing it, but break off a bit and do it. So I think those are the skills. So the data skill is going to be absolutely critical, because the engine oil, the oil that lubricates all this, is going to be the personalized data, the first person data, approved by consumers, and no doubt we'll get into that. In our pre-prep meeting, we talked about a little bit about that issue. But I think that's the core skill. And then it's going to be about understanding, agility is really important. So managing an organization extremely flexibly and responsively. I mean, every conversation I have with somebody in the marketing function, it doesn't have to be the CMO or the CSO or the CIO, complains about the fact that they don't move fast enough, they don't have enough control, and that the first-party data assets are very difficult to bring together. So that latter point is going to become absolutely critical.
Oh, makes so much sense.
Yeah.
Hugely, hugely important. Well, anyway, I thought I'd experiment with AI, obviously, with this conversation. So I asked it a few questions.
Which one did you ask? Was it
ChatGPT, actually?
Okay.
Yeah, ChatGPT. So I said, give me some questions for Sir Martin Sorrell.
Yeah.
The first one I thought
They said who?
Who? Exactly. Remind me. Anyway, first one. What's the best question for Sir Martin Sorrell were you to interview you, right? Now, I think this is a bit obvious, and you may have already answered this, so they get more interesting as they go along. The biggest disruption to our industry in the next 10 years. So maybe, I tell you what, I'll put a twist on it. You can't say AI.
Okay.
So beyond AI, biggest disruption to our business.
So there are two. I wouldn't say just one. One is geographical, so fragmentation, different power bases, the rise of Latin America, the rise of the Middle East, the rise of India and an Asian contact, not just India, Vietnam and Indonesia and Thailand and Philippines and Malaysia and Singapore. That doesn't mean old Asia, meaning Japan and Australia and New Zealand, are not going to continue to be important. But the big question in Asia is China. Do you extend your business in China? If you have a big share, and I define big as, China is 18 trillion out of 100 trillion GDP, so logically should be around 20%. If you have 20%, maybe you stick because you're worried about Taiwan supply chains, Apple and Tesla going to Mexico, etc., for supply chains. If you're, like, I think Unilever has 7% of its revenue in China. Procter went into China and Unilever went to India. So you want to up the ante in China. So we have a small business, a very good business. As my mother said, good things come in little packages. And, our Chinese business is very strong, but we have to be bigger. And Chinese brands are being very expansive at the minute. And then outbound Chinese, what people don't understand is the platforms, in many cases, they're second. So for Alphabet, for Amazon, for Meta, their second biggest profit unit is outbound Chinese. So these are Chinese firms that are building their businesses internationally. So geographical fragmentation and the outlook for Europe, I hate to be depressing in France, but here goes. I think France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and the UK are going to have, talking to clients, it tends to be, it's difficult to get growth in those markets, so we're very focused on efficient costs. So one thing is changing, so it used to be globalization. You can say it's deglobalization if you want, but it's certainly fragmentation. So picking your battlegrounds, before didn't matter where you were, as long as the demographics were fine, free trade, and always operated to help you. Now, there are barriers. Make America great again, nearshoring, onshoring, whatever. I mean, it makes it much more difficult. So that's one thing. And the second thing, and AI comes into this, is because GDP growth is going to be lower than it was, and interest rates and inflation higher than they were, and interest rates will be higher for longer, I think clients are going to find growth very difficult and margins will come under pressure. And as a result of that, they're going to be looking for efficiencies. And those efficiencies will be driven by technology, not just AI, but blockchain and metaverse too.
Next question I asked ChatGPT. Give me the most surprising question for Sir Martin. Now, the most surprising question, according to ChatGPT, was if you could go back in time, what advice would you give yourself?
When you look back on things, if you spotted something, you never, this is not a new thought because Bill Gates has said this, I think, on many occasions. You never jump in. I mean, you may spot a change, but you never execute as quickly or as expansively as you should do. So, if I think back to WPP in 1997, I was interviewed by the Harvard Business Review. I waxed lyrical about the importance of the internet. And, we really didn't go as fast as we should have done. I think when I exited, about 40% of WPP's revenues we calculated, and we used to look at it every quarter and every year, every half year and every year. It was around 40%. And, I don't think we went fast enough. I mean, with the benefit of 2020 hindsight. So I would say the mistakes you make are not, if you spot trends, is to not, particularly if you have analog businesses or you have established businesses, so there's a resistance to change anyway. You never go fast enough. So that's.
And what's so to flip that on its head? What
I mean, yeah, go on. Sorry.
I was going to, what is the secret to going faster? So if the first step is acknowledging.
Well, the secret to going faster is not having any blockages in the system. And, unfortunately, analog businesses have blockages. You have an analog thing that's producing the profit. You remember the early days of the internet. Should you build something separately? Should you make it part of the core? And most people, I think, thought you'd keep it separate because the core reacts. The other thing is, performance is always based on short term. I mean, at the moment, the other thing that's happening at the moment is because the economy is under pressure, because GDP growth is less and inflation and putting it under pressure as well, and, people are very focused on short-term results. So going lower down the funnel is really activation and performance is super important. And I hear a lot, particularly of new CEOs coming in or being promoted, saying to CMOs, what the hell are we doing this upper funnel stuff? Which is anathema here because people want to build big brand campaigns. But it doesn't mean that you can't build big ideas around short-term performance. And I think, like it or not, particularly in 23 and 24, and maybe even beyond that. After the US presidential election in 24, I think activation and performance is going to become even more important. Again, anathema here, because people are looking for big, Manhattan landing rather than that poster ad. I think probably would be the thing. So
is there a risk of being an over reliance?
Yeah, there's always a risk of it, but look, it's a fact of life. And the average life of a CEO is it's getting shorter, and it's probably maybe 4 or 5 years. The average life of a company, I think, in the S&P 500 or the FTSE is like 12 years or 13 years. I think McKinsey had a statistic for that a little while ago. So the answer is attention spans. Consumers are getting shorter. Facebook tells us in Italy a few years ago that the average Italian woman spends 2 seconds on a post. Our response is to create a 2-second ad, right? It's not a 15-second TV ad.
Yeah.
So I think you have to acclimatize, and I think life has to become much more shorter. It's much more volatile. When my dad said to me, build a brand, he believed in long-term brand building. Again, it's anathema to say this, but I'll say it. I'm not sure that that's as relevant today as it was historically. So attention spans are shifting, are shortening. Attention is shifting all the time. We're being bombarded, and the volatility in the environment, geographically and technologically, is so violent that it induces huge changes. Nvidia goes from $500 billion or whatever it was to $1 trillion on thematics, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this is on a belief. I mean, the valuation multiple looks extraordinary, but or Tesla, another good example. Right? The valuation on Tesla, despite all the bumps, continues to defy gravity or normal gravity. So I think we live in a very different world where the private equity model is probably the best model, because what's their time frame? 4 or 5 years.
It is usually, yeah.
Right? So really good example. And I won't say what it was. So this afternoon I heard that a digital company had run into a major Me Too problem. It is owned by a private equity company. Okay, nobody knows it. It was written up in the press today. Don't want to say where and when, but it was written up, and it didn't mention at all that the ownership of that company is by one of the major private equity companies, which is really interesting, because if it had happened, think about Anheuser-Busch, right, and Bud Light, nanosecond, boom,
it'll be everywhere,
right?
Yeah.
It was written up in a major European newspaper, one country in Europe, and it hasn't seen the light of day yet. Maybe it will. Maybe as a result of this podcast it will.
Yes.
But it's really interesting. Private equity is insulated. And when you say that to the private equity people, they say, no. But it is. Because they're not in the public gaze. And so it's real. I
briefly worked in private equity, and I remember the owner saying it's called private for a reason, and we want to keep it that way.
Yeah,
it's
like I mean, WPP sold control of Kantar, and Bain Capital, from what we can see from the published data on the Kantar website, is doing much, much better. And I look at that and I'm particularly irritated by it, because why didn't we manage when we owned Kantar? I thought it was a bloody good idea to own it and to have it as part, but we didn't manage to integrate it or run it as well as Bain Capital. And maybe doing it in the private lens, that clearly there was a big cost structural issue in France and Germany, Italy and Spain, and obviously it's more difficult to do restructuring in those markets, as the tech companies have found out recently. But in a private atmosphere, it's much easier to do than if you've got a BBC or
100%.
Everybody else breathing down your neck.
So the next question I asked ChatGPT was, give me the most controversial question for you. Now, this is where it gets interesting, because it responded to say, when asking a controversial question, Sir Martin, you should make it thought-provoking but respectful. So it appears ChatGPT is even giving advice on how to deliver a question.
Yeah.
What it came up with, what are the ethical considerations when looking at how advertising uses our personal data?
Yeah, I think it's not an easy answer to that, but I think as long as the consumer knows what he or she is signing up for, it's fine. But we are bedeviled by when you try to sign up for a website. The agreement is like 16 pages long, and
have you ever read it? Have you ever read?
No. I must admit, no. I mean, it's extremely tiresome, and I actually came into contact with a third-party data company that we were looking at many years ago, and I didn't realise that I'd signed up. It was on American Express actually, that I'd signed up for what they were using the data for. But I think really, and I can remember going back. We had Siegel and Gale as part of WPP at some point in time. I still think it still is. Anyway, but what they did was they simplified the language for applying for a passport. So and the language, the immigration form, and they simplified the language, and it's exactly the same. I mean, it was complex, and you had to have a PhD to figure it out. What you do is you simplify it, and I think as long as the consumer knows, and maybe give the option of the consumer to control the data that he or she has, which he or she could sell if they wanted to. So as long as they know and they're conscious of it, that's fine. But if they don't know what they're signing up for, that's a problem. So I think simplifying the execution is critically important.
So next question I attempted. Give me a question you've never been asked. Now, I think you have been asked this, but anyway, we'll go with this. What's the decision you've made in your career that you most regret making?
Yeah, well, I've been asked that. It's always the answer is 89 Ogilvy deal, convertible preferred stock. It was a 7.6% net coupon, which you couldn't deduct for tax. So basically, it cost you double that at that time, 13% or so. And it made us too highly levered. With Thomson, we did half shares, half cash, and then we sold off the Japanese property for virtually half of the purchase price. And the incumbent management, and actually it was Morgan Stanley, who was the defending bank, never twigged that. They valued it at 30 million. We sold it for 205 million.
Really?
7 million, yeah. But with Ogilvy, we did half debt and a half convertible preferred. And I forgot that in a bear market, convertible preferred is not equity, it's debt. So I think that was the biggest mistake.
And what's the implication of that mistake on you?
Well, the implication was, we ran into difficulties in the early 90s, 91, 92 recession.
Yeah.
And we had to restructure the company. We had to do two debt restructurings. So in 1990, we focused on organic growth and grew the business and did very well. And then in 2000, we merged with Y&R, which was really a takeover of Y&R, and then Gray in 2004. It was fine in the end, but it was a pretty fraught. It was a mistake.
Yeah. Talked a lot about WPP, obviously, and hugely successful. Just one question on that before I'd love to ask you about S4 is, what was the secret to that growth over so many years to become the biggest holding?
Well, we had phases. I mean, we had the initial growth phase from 87 to 85 to 89. JWT in 87, Ogilvy in 89. The hiccup, or more than a hiccup, the heart spasm. In the 90s, organic growth focus through the 90s. I think we did cotton on to the web fairly early, but we didn't go hard enough. Gray was a great deal. That worked out extremely well. We did, the Kantar deal. With the benefit now of 2020 hindsight, we didn't manage it as well as we should have done. But you see that with the packaged goods companies. Nestle sold off control of some of their ice cream businesses, Unilever their tea businesses, and the private equity companies that bought them, PIA, I think, for the ice cream business at Nestle, and CVC for the tea business, they all seem to be doing extremely well in private equity hands. So it's about sort of focus. So we went through phases there. So there wasn't one consistent pattern to it. And S4 is the same. We've had a phase of very strong growth through mergers, as we call them, because it'd be 50-50 deals in terms of cash and equity. And now we're in a consolidation phase. So you have different phases. I don't know the secret of success. I mean, the WPP model is a multi-branded model. I think that's not fit for purpose anymore. My own view is they should break WPP up because WPP is now valued at $12 billion. Publicis and Omnicom are valued at 19 billion each, and IPG is valued at 15. It doesn't make any sense at all. I mean, people say, well, WPP's got more debt, but they've got 1.4 billion sitting in Kantar, in their minority interest in Kantar, on the basis of the valuations that people can impute, and then about another 400 million in FSG, the PR company that they've sort of spun off a bit. So you've got sort of 2 billion that would take care of the debt.
Yeah.
So it makes no sense to me, and I think I think they're probably too fat and happy.
Well, one question I want to ask,
a bit naughty, but I think they're probably too fat and happy.
Obviously, huge success. Creating the biggest holding company in the world. What motivates you to start again and build?
I don't plan to play golf, or I don't like to play golf. I did work.
You don't like being bored.
I did work for Mark McCormack, and I did work, for Arnold Palmer and Gary Player and Jack Nicklaus and Arnold and Tony Jacklin and Peter Oosterhuis and Clive Clark and all people like that. So I saw golf at first hand, and I don't want to play golf. It's an old man's game. I prefer to play cricket.
As we started out.
Yeah. Although, it's not a great thing to say, having lost by 2 wickets yesterday. That's a bit galling.
Oh. Well, I've got a few quick fire questions. Yeah. I thought it'd be fun to hit you with some unusual, different questions as well.
Okay.
I've just finished watching Succession. It was incredible. It appears to be based fairly closely on the Murdoch empire. How close to real life do you think it is?
I think it's pretty close. I mean, I remember the woman who was responsible for the scripts. There's a big team, and she described on Radio 4 how they all get together for 30 days and sit in a room and bounce ideas off one another. And she said, the fact that they say they don't watch it is indicative of how close near to the knuckle it is. I found the actors who played Ronan and Shiv and whatever, because I know a little bit, not very well, but I know Lachlan, know James, know Rupert and Elizabeth. It didn't strike me. Brian Cox doesn't strike me being Rupert, and I don't think the three kids. The 3 Murdoch kids. So I think there was a dissonance there. Having said that, the plot, I wasn't so keen on series 1, 2, and 3, but I thought 4 was pretty good.
It was pretty good, wasn't it?
And the final episode is set up for a sequel, but they tell us isn't. I would bet it'll come back.
Oh, of course it will. Yeah. They always say that, don't they? Just to keep you watching. Tell me something you've never told anybody else.
Oh, well, it's not. I told you.
You did tell me this morning, by the way. But we'll pretend that didn't happen.
Oh, well, okay. So, I was talking about. I was in Amsterdam, and somebody asked me. One of the monks. I saw the media monks in Amsterdam and Hilversum. We have about 750 that sit there in Amsterdam and Hilversum. And one of the questions they asked me is, what does nobody do? So I wear what is. I'm Jewish, and I wear a tzitzis, right? And tzitzis has fringes. I mean, the central prayers say you should have fringes on the corner of all your garments. So instead of having a fringe on the corner of every one of our garments, we have a garment we wear underneath, which have fringes on them. So I wear a tzitzis, which happens to be my dad's tzitzis. So that's sort of. I'm not Orthodox. I'm probably a 3-day-a-year Jew, which means Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. But having said that, I do that. So that's that's something that hasn't been publicised until now.
Yes, there you go. We're exclusive on this podcast. If you were to, and this might be a bit close to what you are doing, but if you were to build a fantasy agency, like a fantasy football team where you could pick full service agency, you could build it from scratch, money's no object. What would you? Who would you? How do you put it together?
Well, I'd have elements of it. If I look at our competition, I always come back to Accenture. I don't get the feeling that Accenture are as enthusiastic as they were about the area that we're in. When I say we're, the industry is in sort of digital. I mean, it appears to be about. Accenture is I think 60 billion of revenue. It's huge, 800,000 people, and I think digital communications or the digital area that we compete with them is probably, I don't know, 7 or 8 billion of it. So it's pretty big. But I don't get the impression that they're as focused on it, because, if you have a $60 billion beast, you to feed that beast, you have to have big contracts, not the sort of contracts that we compete for, which are chump change in relation to what they need to feed their beast. So one of the answers would be, you have that digital piece, so, what is called Droga 5 or Song or whatever they call it now. I think David Droga said everybody has to change their name for Song except Droga 5. And maybe the monkeys in Australia as well. Yeah. So that would be one part of it. I would say there are bits inside WPP that I think are really interesting, like AKQA and maybe a bit of VML, but more AKQA, I think, than VML, to be fair. And then inside IPG, there were bits, RGA and Huge. They're not as good as they were, from what we hear. And Wyden would be another one, right? Which are the super good bits. And then, there are specialists. Oliver, that would be one, which competes on the content side. Jellyfish, high volume, low profitability. I mean, Brandtech couldn't get that deal done. They couldn't raise the money for it, so they merged on the basis of equity just recently. It took them a long time to do that. So you've got your sort of the consultant piece. You've got bits of the holding companies, the digital, the Essence media business is a really good media business. I don't think merging it with Mediacom made it better. Probably it probably made Mediacom better, but not so much Essence. So there are bits of the holding companies, and not Publicis Sapient. That obviously has been helpful to them. And then there are sort of specialists. So if money was no object, and then the other area adjacent to Accenture would be companies like Globant, which we had. So when I was at WPP, we bought 20% of Globant at $11 a share. It went public at 22. They sold it. It broke my heart when they sold it for, I think it was about 80. It got to 350. It's now about 180. Really? It's now 180 with the market coming back. But I mean, it's gone from 11 to 180 even today. Super business. Yep. And EPAM, Endava, ThoughtWorks, those sorts of businesses are really interesting.
No, fascinating. Well, look, we've just run out of time, but right. Martin, thank you so much for sharing that. You've been absolutely splendid.
Thank you, Ray.
And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Hope
everybody else thought so too.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, audience, as well. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Sir Martin Sorrell and found plenty in there to get your head around. If you'd like to get more content like that, then please do hit the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts. If you're watching, go over to YouTube and hit subscribe there as well. If you'd like to follow me, I'm John at Uncensored CMO, or you can find me on LinkedIn under John Evans. It's been a pleasure to have you with me. I'll see you next time.